Shortly after midnight on 6 September 2007, an unidentified building in the Deir ez-Zor desert in eastern Syria sits under a hard, electric moon. Inside, the lights are off. By satellite, it looks like a routine military structure, square and mute against the sand. In an Israeli operations room hundreds of kilometers away, screens show grainy infrared shapes crossing into Syrian airspace. Later, the International Atomic Energy Agency will write that the structure destroyed here was very likely an undeclared nuclear reactor. On one of the side tables in that room, a small potted plant stands next to a stack of printed photographs taken months earlier. Inside the building, graphite blocks, cooling channels, a Syrian official beside a North Korean technician. Someone idly turns the pot a few centimeters, a domestic gesture in a place built for war. Outside, the night is perfectly calm when the pilots receive the final word. The report will later mark the mission as a success. The cost will be written somewhere else. By September 2002, Tel Aviv, analysts in Israel's Military Intelligence Directorate had begun to circle Syria on their maps for an unfamiliar reason. A newly drafted top-secret assessment warned that Syria was engaged in secret projects that Israel had not previously tracked, with activity in areas that could contribute to a future military nuclear program. Though no reactor had yet been identified, the paper was compiled in offices, where the air smelled of burnt coffee and printer toner. Then senior intelligence officers, including Amos Yadlin, pushed for closer monitoring, while Meir Dagan, recently appointed head of Mossad, read the memo as part of a broader profiling effort of Syria's president, Bashar al-Assad, whose contacts with North Korean delegations on advanced weapons were beginning to attract notice. On screen, high-resolution satellites showed only a regular grid of buildings and known bases. Syria relied heavily on secrecy and physical compartmentalization rather than open communication. The reactor did not yet have a name in Israeli files. It existed only as anxiety framed in cautious language. In the assessment, the threat was still hypothetical. For the people writing it, the ambiguity meant longer hours and quieter doubts, not yet a decision for war. The light in those offices stayed on late into the night, the hum of computers mixing with the scratch of pens on classified paper. Somewhere in a drawer, someone kept a small cactus that never needed watering, a fitting companion for work that required patience measured in years rather than weeks. The memo would sit in a classified folder for years before its warnings found a concrete shape in the desert. By 2003, American and Israeli intelligence services had traced unusual patterns, contacts between Syria and North Korea, and construction in a remote area on the Euphrates River near Al-Kibar in Deir ez-Zor province. Satellite imagery showed a square building beginning to rise there, its location far from major population centers and infrastructure. Through 2004 and 2006, commercial and military imagery recorded the site's evolution. The building grew taller, a pumping station appeared on the riverbank, and service structures clustered nearby. Analysts noted that it resembled a box with almost no windows, a common feature of reactor buildings. But its isolation and Syrian silence left room for doubt. Inside Syria, the project was run through the Syrian Atomic Energy Commission. Its head, Ibrahim Othman, would later be identified in photographs taken inside the structure, standing next to a North Korean nuclear official. In Deir ez-Zor city, a few dozen kilometers away, daily life carried on. Markets opened, children walked to school. Ba'ath party banners faded in the sun. The building at Al-Kibar was referred to in Syrian accounts simply as a military installation. The cover was not theatrical. It relied on distance, sand, and routine. For the workers who drove out toward Al-Kibar at dawn, the site was another assignment. Only a handful knew what its concrete shell was meant to protect. The desert wind erased tire tracks by noon, and the building cast its shadow eastward as the sun moved west. The first clear interior view of this hall would come not from a satellite, but from a camera carried by someone who was no longer loyal. In December 2006, a senior Syrian official traveled to London, reportedly under a false name. Mossad had already flagged his booking at a central London hotel and dispatched a team of undercover operatives to the city. The open record does not specify their cover identities or the hotel floor plan. It does agree on one critical detail. At some point during the visit, the official left his laptop unattended in his room. Agents from Mossad gained access and either copied its contents directly or installed a covert program designed to exfiltrate data and monitor communications. Public accounts differ on the exact mechanism, but converge on the outcome. Highly sensitive, high-resolution images and documents left the safety of a Syrian hard drive for a system controlled by Israel. Back in Tel Aviv, in a secure room where even phones were banned, an analyst opened the first decrypted file. The photograph showed a large hall, graphite blocks, and reactor-like structures. Among them stood Ibrahim Othman, clearly recognizable to anyone who followed Syrian nuclear affairs, beside a North Korean technician. The dimensions of the room, the arrangement of the machinery, the faces frozen in professional discussion, all of it spoke to a collaboration that had been invisible until this moment. On a side windowsill in that room, a small office plant was watered every few days by whoever arrived first. It became a quiet ritual against the fluorescent light and the classified images on screen. For the operatives in London, the mission ended when the door closed and the laptop was left where they found it. For the analysts who received the files, the operation was just beginning. Within months, one of these photos would be carried by Mossad's director into the West Wing of the White House. The 2002 Israeli intelligence memo and the 2006 London intrusion were two ends of a single thread. The first was suspicion without form. The second gave that suspicion an interior, a face, and North Korean machinery in a Syrian building. Over the same years, the IAEA struggled with transparency issues elsewhere, particularly in Iran, and the United States, still engaged in Iraq, was wary of new military confrontations. Against this background, proof of a covert Syrian reactor meant not just a new target, but a new test of Israel's informal begin doctrine. The commitment to prevent hostile states in the region from acquiring nuclear weapons capability by preemptive strikes when necessary. In early 2007 Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, the newly acquired images from the London operation moved across a secure chain. Mossad, military intelligence, the Prime Minister's office. Technical experts compared the interior layout to the North Korean reactor at Yongbyon. The hall dimensions, arrangement of graphite moderator blocks, and absence of electricity-generating infrastructure all reinforced the view that this was a plutonium production reactor, not a civilian power plant. Mayor Dagan, shaped by his own wartime experiences and a career focused on preemption, pressed the urgency. Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, still politically weakened after the 2006 Lebanon War, now faced a decision that could either restore deterrence or trigger a regional conflict. The reactor was christened Al-Kibar in Israeli documents, aligning with the local place name. In one internal intelligence document later declassified, analysts wrote that Syria was engaged in secret nuclear-related projects already in their initial phase, echoing the 2002 warning with new weight. Maps, printed imagery, and technical assessments accumulated in folders. The plant on the table was pushed aside to make room. Naming the site Al-Kibar, Deir al-Zur, the box folded it into bureaucratic language. The act of naming did not make the decision easier. It simply made the danger printable. Somewhere in the building, a coffee machine gurgled through another cycle, indifferent to the weight of the photographs spread across the conference table. The next audience for these photos would not be in Tel Aviv, but in Washington. In early May 2007, Mayor Dagan entered the White House to brief U.S. National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley. He carried pictures taken inside the Syrian facility, including one of Ibrahim Othman standing beside a North Korean official in the reactor hall. To American intelligence professionals, still under scrutiny for assessments in Iraq, the dossier was both compelling and unsettling. The CIA's technical analysts assessed the case as strong evidence for a reactor constructed with North Korean assistance, but expressed lower confidence that it was part of a fully operational weapons program, noting the apparent absence of fuel and some support infrastructure at that time. The distinction between reactor and weapons program became central to U.S. internal debates. In his memoir, former President George W. Bush later wrote that Ehud Olmert asked the United States to bomb the facility. Bush declined, citing the intelligence community's reservations and the risk of another Middle Eastern war. He recounted that Olmert did not seek a formal green light but ultimately acted independently. The watering of plants continued elsewhere. In suburban Washington homes, staffers kept their lawns green through one more humid American summer. Inside the Situation Room, the reactor at Al-Kibar was an image on a screen, pinned between other crises: Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran's own nuclear ambitions. For Washington, the Syrian reactor was one dossier among many. For Israel, it was an existential question compressed into satellite pixels and a few dozen covert photographs. After Washington declined to act, the burden of the decision shifted back entirely to Jerusalem. Through summer 2007, Israel's senior security cabinet met repeatedly in Jerusalem. The exact sequence of conversations remains partly classified, but open sources describe a debate among Ehud Olmert, Defense Minister Ehud Barak, Mossad Chief Meir Dagan, and military intelligence leaders over timing, method, and diplomatic fallout. Dagan reportedly argued strongly for a covert airstrike, convinced that Bashar al-Assad would limit his response if Israel maintained total ambiguity. Some U.S. officials worried such a strike could spiral into a wider war. Israeli assessments, reflected later in memoirs and interviews, calculated the opposite, that a quick, clean operation followed by silence reduced the chance of escalation. Israeli operational planners began to draft contingencies: electronic warfare to blind Syrian radar, routes that might briefly cross Turkish airspace, options for special forces on the ground to designate the target, as later suggested by some media reports referencing units such as Shaldag or Sayeret Matkal. These commando details remain disputed in open sources and are best treated as possibilities rather than confirmed facts. In apartments across Israel, the same kind of potted plants seen in the operations room sat on balconies, watered on automatic timers, while their owners attended late-night briefings. Domestic life continued, even as its stability was used in arguments about deterrence and necessity. The formal doctrine, no nuclear capability for hostile neighbors, was clear. The human cost of enforcing it was not written into any doctrine. It was carried by the individuals who voted yes or no in those rooms. When the cabinet finally authorized the strike, the operation received a name that hinted at its secrecy: outside the box. By late August 2007, the operational plan was fixed. The Israeli Air Force designated the mission Operation Outside the Box, while internally the IAF also used a codename, often reported as Silent Tone, for the attack on the Al-Kibar reactor in Deir ez-Zor. The strike package consisted of 8 aircraft, F-15I from Squadron 69 and F-16I from Squadrons 119 and 253, supported by an electronic intelligence aircraft. Crews rehearsed low-level approaches and precision bombing runs, sometimes under cover of other training sorties, so as not to arouse suspicion. The munitions load included precision-guided bombs calibrated to destroy the reactor hall without broader civilian casualties. Israeli cyber and electronic warfare units prepared parallel measures to blind or mislead Syrian radar, an aspect highlighted in later analyses describing advanced electronic attack capabilities. Some reports discuss technologies similar to known electronic intrusion programs, though the exact systems used remain classified. Pilots and planners signed non-disclosure agreements, aware that if the mission went wrong, some of them might not return and the government might not be able to acknowledge what they died doing. In hangars in the Negev, the concrete smelled of fuel and dust. Near the entrance of one briefing room, a plant in a simple plastic pot stood by a water cooler, an ordinary object in a space primed for an extraordinary mission. At this stage, The operation was a sequence of timings, call signs, and waypoints. The human dimension, fear, pride, doubt, was managed in silence and training, not in writing. The jets would leave the ground just before midnight on 5 September 2007. Around 30 minutes before midnight on 5 September 2007, 4 F-15Is and 4 F-16Is took off from air bases in southern Israel, heading north and then east under strict radio silence. The night was clear, the air dry, the cockpits lit only by the glow of instrument panels. Pilots had memorized their routes. There would be no chatter, no corrections called out over open channels. The aircraft climbed to altitude, then descended as they approached the border, hugging terrain to minimize their radar signature. As they approached Syrian airspace, Israeli electronic warfare reportedly targeted elements of the Syrian air defense system, degrading the radar picture. For Syrian operators watching their scopes that night, the screens either froze or showed only a normal sky. Later accounts differ on whether the disruption resembled jamming, false targets, or a simple blackout. Just after 12:40 a.m. on 6 September 2007, the strike aircraft reached the Al-Kibar site. According to declassified Israeli materials, over the course of roughly 10 to 15 minutes, they dropped tens of tons of munitions, obliterating the main structure and its core components. Cockpit footage released years later shows crosshairs settling on a dark rectangle. Flashes, then smoke. In control rooms in Israel, officers tracked telemetry and bomb damage indications. Someone straightened the small plant pot that was nudged earlier, an unconscious gesture while waiting for confirmation. The smell of burned fuel lingered in the desert air above the ruins. By around 2:30 a.m., all 8 jets were back on Israeli runways. None were lost. Official Israeli records marked the operation as clean. No aircraft downed, no overt Syrian retaliation. The reactor destroyed beyond any chance of rehabilitation. In the days after 6 September 2007, Syria sent a letter of complaint to the United Nations, accusing Israel of violating its airspace and bombing a military facility but offering few specifics. The regime of Bashar al-Assad quickly began bulldozing the ruined site at Al-Kibar, removing debris and later constructing a new building over the footprint. This rapid cleanup was visible in commercial satellite imagery taken in the weeks and months after the strike. The bulldozers worked through dust and heat, erasing the physical evidence even as analysts in multiple capitals studied before and after photographs. Israel maintained total official silence. Domestic media were subjected to military censorship, allowed only to quote foreign reports. When asked tangentially, Ehud Olmert spoke in general terms about the courage of Israel's security services without confirming anything. Internationally, speculation flourished. Was the target a nuclear site, a missile depot, or something else? Some analysts noted the quiet reaction of other regional governments, interpreting their non-reaction as tacit approval of a blow against Syrian ambitions. In homes in Damascus and Tel Aviv, people watered plants on balconies, watched television news that said little, and went to work. The gap between what a small circle knew and what the public could see became part of the operation's psychological terrain. Strategically, silence was a tool. It denied Syria a clear casus belli and gave other states an excuse not to react. For individuals on both sides, silence was also a burden, preventing them from speaking openly about the most consequential night of their professional lives. The next attempt to reconstruct what happened would come not from governments, but from inspectors and analysts. In June 2008, inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency visited the Al-Kibar site, now scraped, clean, and rebuilt. Even so, environmental sampling revealed particles of anthropogenic uranium and other traces, consistent with a destroyed nuclear facility. Subsequent IAEA reports in the following years noted these findings and pointed to features resembling those of an undeclared nuclear reactor. Syria denied all allegations, insisting the site was a conventional military installation and arguing that any uranium traces came from Israeli munitions. It restricted further inspector access to related locations and declined to provide detailed design documents. In 2011, IAEA Director General Yukiya Amano stated publicly that the destroyed building was very likely a nuclear reactor that Syria should have declared. The phrasing was cautious by design, but for those who had argued in 2007 that the target was a reactor, it felt like belated confirmation. Technical language in IAEA reports is intentionally dry. For the people who carried out and authorized the strike, each line was also a moral echo, a reminder that they had acted before an international body could speak. The desert at Deir ez-Zor nonetheless remained quiet. Sand covered the edges of new construction. No civilian memorial marked what was once there. The inspectors packed their equipment, filed their reports, and flew home to Vienna. The sun set over the Euphrates as it had for millennia, indifferent to the secrets buried beneath the reconstructed walls. While inspectors argued with diplomats over access, Israel continued to refine the doctrine that led to Al-Kibar. By 2012, more accounts began to surface about the decision-making process behind the 2007 strike. Former U.S. officials described how Ehud Olmert responded when George W. Bush refused to attack, making it clear that Israel intended to act regardless. Analysts at security think tanks dissected the episode as a case study in preemptive action, highlighting the intelligence coup of discovering a secret North Korean-built reactor and the risk that intelligence uncertainties would have justified inaction. The term "begin doctrine" reappeared in policy papers as shorthand for Israel's willingness to unilaterally destroy nuclear facilities in hostile states, following the 1981 strike on Iraq's Osrak reactor and now Syria's Al-Kibar. In interviews, Olmert and others emphasized that the strike was designed not to provoke a broader war but to eliminate a specific threat while minimizing Syrian humiliation and the impulse to retaliate. For the Mossad officers and aircrew involved, the aftermath was more private. Some received commendations behind closed doors. Others moved on to new assignments. In their homes, they watered plants on balconies or in small inner courtyards, ordinary routines that continued regardless of how history books would frame their actions. The scent of jasmine in a Tel Aviv evening carried no trace of the desert mission years before. In strategic literature, the Al-Kibar strike is often presented as a model. At the human level, it is a set of memories that cannot be discussed in full, even years later. A decade after the raid, Israel would finally speak openly about what it destroyed in the desert. On 21 March 2018, after more than 10 years of deliberate ambiguity, Israel officially acknowledged that its Air Force destroyed a Syrian nuclear reactor at Al-Kibar on the night of 5-6 September 2007. The IDF released cockpit videos, satellite imagery, and an official narrative naming Operation Outside the Box and the IAF codename Silent Tone. Alongside these materials, Israeli authorities declassified additional documents, including a 2002 intelligence memo, warning that Syria was engaged in secret projects, potentially related to a military nuclear program. Evidence that Israel's concern predated the London laptop operation by several years. Media interviews with former officials, including Ehud Olmert, Amos Yadlin, and retired IAF officers, reconstructed the operation from their perspectives. The intelligence buildup, the Washington briefings, the political risk calculation, and the quiet satisfaction when Syria remained largely silent after the strike. For families of the pilots involved, the footage offered, for the first time, images they could openly acknowledge as part of their relatives' history. A daughter watching the grainy cockpit view on a home television might glance over at a plant on a shelf, one that had been in the house since 2007, and see it differently. Declassification served both institutional and personal purposes. It reinforced deterrence, justified past decisions, and allowed participants to integrate clandestine actions into their public identities. The silence had finally broken, though the desert kept its own counsel. In January 2018, Mossad agents infiltrated a warehouse in Tehran, stole a vast archive around 100,000 documents and files related to Iran's nuclear program, and exfiltrated it to Israel in a single night. The operation was different in method from the Al-Kibar strike, but identical in its goal: exposing and neutralizing covert nuclear capabilities before they could mature into direct threats. When Israeli leaders later presented selected documents from that archive to the world, they implicitly invoked both Osirak and Al-Kibar as precedents, cases where early, decisive action against clandestine nuclear infrastructure changed the strategic map. The Syrian reactor became, in this sense, not only a past target, but a reference point in ongoing debates about preemption, deterrence, and the limits of international inspection. Meanwhile, the long shadow of Al-Kibar continued to fall over the Deir ez-Zor desert. The Syrian civil war that erupted in 2011 turned the wider province into a battlefield at various points, but the spot where the reactor once stood remained a military zone rather than a memorial. For intelligence professionals, photographs of the destroyed building and later IAEA reports became training material, used to teach younger analysts how a reactor can be hidden and how it can be found. In a Tel Aviv apartment, someone waters a plant on a narrow balcony overlooking traffic. The city noise is ordinary: scooters, buses, distant construction. On a bookshelf nearby sits a photograph, perhaps of a younger pilot in flight gear, perhaps of a group of analysts around a monitor. The image is not public, and may never be. The plant is healthier now than it was in 2007. The human cost of sustained deception is not always visible in casualty figures or headlines. It resides in memories that cannot be fully shared, in gestures repeated to reclaim normal life after years of secrecy. The last image is not the explosion over Al-Kibar, nor the triumphant briefing. It is the quiet of the desert at night, where wind moves over a rebuilt structure that hides its past, and somewhere far away, water runs from a plastic jug into a plant that has outlived the operation that once unfolded in its shadow.